And the why of security seems to be of increasing importance, meaning why are certain security measures being selected over others? At TIA 2016 Network of the Future and in the Dell TIA NOW studio, we'll look into why some vendors need to adopt security by design for, let's say, the Internet of Things, as well as keeping an eye on the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act and also the design flaws that have led to some security breaches. Here in our studio is Herb Kelsey. He's Chief Architect at Guardtime, and next to him is Brian Finch. He's partner at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw and Pittman. And gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
I'm glad I got through that introduction without any kind of major problems. But thanks for giving us your time. I know you did a similar panel not long ago at TIA 2016, so we appreciate you coming here and having it recorded for the conference. So I want to start off by asking both of you this question, and I'll start with Brian. The why of security, and this is what I mentioned in the introduction, seems to be of increasing importance, meaning why are certain security measures being chosen over others? What do you think that means to you, that question?
Well, it's because it's an evolving landscape at the end of the day when it comes to cybersecurity and the cyber threats that are out there. And companies are increasingly trying to determine what they need to do in order to protect themselves. And it's not just an issue anymore of compliance with certain regulations, it's more about how do we make sure that our networks stay operable, we don't lose data, data is not destroyed, and the other types of threats that we're seeing, the ransomware, lockup of data, major events where companies basically are being shut down because of cyber attacks. And so executives, board members, et cetera, they want to know, why are we doing this? Are we protecting against all the right types of threats that are out there and really are a risk to our company?
And I think that it's going past a financial motive. It's very difficult now to justify an ROI against security when the risks are against your business reputation or your ability to do business. And so I think that a lot of boards now are starting to pay attention to what's happening on the security front, because lapses in that attention mean that they could risk their ability to operate, they could risk their reputation that they've built up over decades. And so, the why of security really starts to become, how do I measure this risk against my business, rather than how do I look at a return on investment for buying a new router or buying another piece of equipment.
I want to move on to our next topic, IoT security. Really talking about security by design. It's really becoming more of a paramount conversation these days, and companies are trying to protect themselves and also be able to deploy their products faster time to market and so forth. How do you compare security by design, and Herb, I'll start with you, to maybe a more rigorous approach like security through obscurity or security through minority?
Yeah, so what I think is happening is that since we are putting more and more devices out in the world, because people are doing more with them and we're getting out to the consumer space, you start to have to look at your security based on building it in from the beginning. If you don't do that, the types of attacks, whether it's ransomware, can be much more devastating, and you really do have to layer in your defense, make sure that you are not just hoping that somebody doesn't get into your system, but you've actually protected against somebody getting into your system.
And to build on what Herb had to say, I think there's two critical points here. Number one, there's an increasing expectation of security with these devices. And consumers, businesses, et cetera, understand that they need these devices to have security built into them. Otherwise, if they tried to layer in security at a later date, that's not going to be as helpful, it's not going to be as effective. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, there is an increasing understanding that if you don't build security in from the beginning, we know that the cyber criminals, the cyber threat actors, are going to exploit that. And when you have incidents where IoT devices are being exploited and they lead to significant crimes, even potentially personal harm, and there is a history or a pattern showing that security hasn't been built in, that's when security is going to be imposed by outside forces, i.e. government regulators, and that won't be good for the IoT market. It won't be good for the developers, it won't be good for the investors, it won't be good for the consumers, because we know that will be an inefficient way to do security.
And when you have the endpoints in people's homes, that makes a difference. When you have the endpoints in your pocket, that makes a difference. So we're not talking about obscure pieces of equipment in an enterprise. We're talking about something that's running your car or in the hands of your child. And that's just going to make a huge difference in what your responsibility is.
That's absolutely right.
Brian, this is an interesting segue into the next topic on our list here, talking about really the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. What real protections does that offer, not only for consumers, but really for the commercial sector?
Well, it really is aimed more towards the commercial sector at the end of the day. The notion of the Cyber Information Sharing Act is for companies to share threat information with the government and other companies so that they can have a better collective defense. There can be a more rapid response to emerging threats. That's important. It's a critical step, but also the government was a little bit late to the game on this. This is something that probably should have happened about 7 or 8 years ago. Those are the machinations of Congress. It takes a long time for these things to happen, but it's a good step forward. I would note that when it comes to whether it's an incentive or not for companies to share information, it's not a bad thing, but I wouldn't call this piece of legislation the greatest incentive that the government has ever created. It basically sets up a formal structure. It offers some small liability protections, mainly related to if you share a piece of information, you can't be sued for doing that. But where companies are really concerned is when they get the threat information, can they be sued for making a bad decision? CISA did not provide that type of liability protection. That's a significant gap that needs to be addressed in the future.
And the liability protection doesn't create an environment where they feel comfortable from a reputation perspective.
Right.
And so there's a downstream, even if you have liability protection, there's still a downstream in terms of your reputation.
Yeah, and the reputation point is an absolutely critical one. We cannot overestimate the impact of Edward Snowden when it comes to information sharing. Rightly or wrongly, he has impacted the way many countries view private sector entities in the U.S. sharing information with government. And so that always lingers in these discussions. And companies want to do the right thing, but they do have to be careful with respect to their global markets.
Of course, anytime you talk about cybersecurity, at least in the sort of mainstream conversations, we talk about these security breaches, these global security breaches that are sort of headline news. Herb, I want to ask you, what are, just from more of a granular perspective, from Guardtime's perspective, what's a significant design flaw that would lead to a security breach like that?
So, what I say is that hackers have two favorite friends. One's a default password, and then another are lots of devices on your network because it's hard to keep track. I think the thing that's most significant to me in my industry is integrity, is that if you have not made certain that your information, whether it's your fundamental data or it's information that you're going to deliver out to an IoT device, has integrity, and you can guarantee that, you've lost. Because no matter what you do to protect yourself to make sure that you have service, no matter what you do to protect yourself that you have access to your service, if the fundamental information is counterfeit from the beginning, the rest of the measures don't matter. So I look at something like the OPM breach, where the government lost all the information related to people's security clearances. The DNI and the rest of the people involved after the fact came back and said the most devastating thing is we are not sure what information is good or not. And you can take that back to a Sony breach or a Target breach. So I think that one of the security measures that is missing and allows for a lot of devastation is the lack of integrity in the fundamental information or in the infrastructure that you're providing.
Yeah, and I would add on top of that, I think one of the fundamental security design flaws is that there's a lot of legacy software that's out there that is no longer being supported by the developer, and that's normal. There's an end of life cycle when it comes to a lot of these software and hardware programs. Companies need to realize that if they're going to continue to use products, software, hardware, et cetera, that isn't being maintained from a security perspective by the original manufacturer, it's their responsibility, and they need to look into that and make sure that ultimately they are either replacing it with newer technology that is being supported, or that they are encapsulating security around that to get around those flaws that, frankly, I like to say, our adversaries ultimately have what the military refer to as freedom of movement. They basically have all the time, all the energy, and all the resources necessary to pick and choose their attacks. And if you have a security program that's not being supported by security engineers, they can just sit there and probe it until they're ready and launch an attack that will be devastating and will be all over before anyone realizes it.
Cybersecurity is always an interesting topic just because it's very fluid, but it's great to have somebody from on the panel from a policy perspective and then somebody from the private sector to give their points of view. So we appreciate both of you giving not only the conference your time, but also the studio your time as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
it.
And thank you for joining us at TIA 2016 Network of the Future and also in the Dell TIA NOW studio. For more of our coverage here, you can go to tianow.org. So long.